She never imagined her life would unravel so quickly. A powerful CEO admired by many, now found herself paralyzed, trapped not only by her wheelchair but by the cruel stares and whispers that followed her everywhere. When she agreed to a blind date, she hoped just for one night to feel human again. But the moment the mechanic walked in, everything shifted. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a collision of two broken souls, where prejudice and hidden scars threatened to destroy them both. What happened next would not only shatter her walls, but prove that kindness can bloom in the unlikeliest of places. Her name was Claire Donovan, a woman whose sharp mind and relentless determination had built an empire from nothing. In boardrooms, her presence commanded respect. She was the kind of CEO who never took no for an answer. But one tragic accident had changed everything. A single moment, a slick patch of road, a twisted frame of steel, and the sound of sirens in the night had left her body forever altered. Now confined to a wheelchair, Claire found herself facing not only the challenges of mobility but the crushing weight of society's pity. People no longer looked at her the same way. Clients who once admired her vision now spoke slower, softer, as if she had suddenly become fragile. Friends disappeared, uncertain how to act around her, and though her wealth and success remained, her heart carried a hollow loneliness. The world, it seemed, had reduced her to the chair she sat in, forgetting the fierce spirit within. Against her better judgment, Claire agreed to a blind date set up by a well-meaning friend. "It'll be good for you," they insisted. She wanted to believe it. She wanted, just for one evening, to feel something beyond the invisible chains that bound her life. The meeting place was a quiet restaurant tucked away from the city's chaos, a spot chosen deliberately to avoid too much attention. But as the evening approached, anxiety gnawed at her. What if he looked at her the way everyone else did? What if the night ended with that familiar, suffocating silence of rejection? Still, she rolled into the restaurant, her heart heavy but hopeful. She didn't know that her blind date, the mechanic with grease-stained hands and scars of his own, was about to change everything. The restaurant buzzed softly with conversations, the clinking of glasses and the low hum of background music. Claire maneuvered her chair to the table her friend had reserved, her mind rehearsing polite smiles and guarded responses. She was prepared for disappointment, prepared to see a flicker of hesitation, maybe even pity, in the eyes of her date. Then he walked in. He was nothing like she expected. Not polished, not in a suit like the executives she'd been surrounded by her whole career. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt that couldn't quite hide the grease stains on his forearms, a detail that immediately gave away his profession. A mechanic. His steps were steady, his frame broad, his gaze straightforward and unashamed. For a moment, Claire almost forgot the wheels beneath her because his eyes, warm and unflinching, didn't drop to her chair the way others did. They met hers directly, and she felt seen in a way she hadn't in months. Still, doubt whispered in her ear. He's being polite. Wait until the sympathy sets in. The evening stretched into a series of unexpected moments. The mechanic, whose name was Daniel, didn't fill the air with shallow compliments or forced cheer. He listened. He laughed with her, not at her. He spoke of his life in a way that was unpolished, real, and refreshingly human. Claire found herself leaning into the conversation, forgetting the barrier she thought her chair created. For the first time in a long while, her laughter wasn't strained. It was genuine. But as their conversation deepened, shadows of insecurity began to surface. A couple at the next table stared too long, whispering and shaking their heads, as if silently questioning what a man like Daniel was doing with a woman like her. Their judgmental glances cut into Claire's fragile confidence. She shifted uncomfortably, bracing herself for Daniel to notice and withdraw. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his voice as though he hadn't seen the gawkers at all. He shared stories of long nights in his garage, fixing cars he couldn't afford to own, of the sacrifices he made for his younger sister after their parents died. Each word painted him not as a man diminished by hardship, but as someone who carried his scars with quiet pride. Claire felt her guard slowly crumble. Beneath the hardened shell of a CEO and the insecurities of her new reality, she found herself connecting with someone who valued her not for her power, her wealth, or her appearance, but for her humanity. Yet, just as the evening seemed to promise a spark of hope, the air shifted. A familiar figure appeared at the entrance of the restaurant. an old business rival who had once courted her company, and now saw her as nothing more than a fallen CEO. His loud, mocking voice carried across the room as he greeted acquaintances, his eyes soon locking onto Claire and her unexpected companion. The night that had begun with laughter was about to take a turn. The stares grew sharper, the whispers louder, and Claire realized that this dinner, this fragile attempt at rediscovering herself, was about to be tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. The rival's booming laughter cut through the restaurant, sharp and cruel. He strolled closer, his smirk widening as if he'd stumbled upon the perfect stage for his mockery. "Well, if it isn't Claire Morgan," he sneered loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "From boardroom queen to wheelchair sideshow. And dining with a mechanic?" His gaze slid to Daniel, dripping with disdain. Quite the downgrade. The words landed like a slap, pulling every eye in the room toward their table. Claire's breath caught in her throat, heat rising to her cheeks. She had weathered corporate takedowns, hostile board meetings, and ruthless negotiations, but nothing stung quite like being reduced to her chair and the man across from her. She wanted to disappear, to sink beneath the weight of humiliation. Yet before she could muster a response, Daniel rose slowly from his chair. The quiet strength in his posture silenced even the rival's smug chuckle. "Funny thing about cars," Daniel said, his voice calm but commanding. "Doesn't matter how shiny the outside is. What matters is what's under the hood. Same goes for people." He glanced at Claire, his expression steady, unshaken. "And this woman has more grit, more brilliance, more fight than anyone I've ever met. You couldn't match her on her best day, even when you stood on two legs." The rival faltered, his smirk slipping as the tables around them erupted in murmurs of approval. Claire's chest tightened, not with shame, but with something unfamiliar in recent months: pride. For a moment, she saw herself reflected in Daniel's unwavering gaze, not as the woman bound to a wheelchair, not as a fallen CEO, but as the resilient fighter who had built an empire against the odds. His words had stripped the room of cruelty and replaced it with respect. The rival muttered something under his breath and stormed out, his attempt at humiliation crumbling into ashes. And as the whispers faded, Claire realized the night hadn't broken her. It had given her a glimpse of something she thought she'd lost forever: the possibility of love, and the courage to embrace it. When the rival's footsteps faded from the restaurant, a hush lingered, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Then, like a ripple in still water, the quiet transformed into something else: applause. Soft at first, then stronger, as if the room itself had chosen sides. Claire blinked, stunned. Strangers, diners, servers, even the maitre d' were clapping. Not for the spectacle, but for the truth Daniel had spoken aloud. For her. She hadn't expected the blind date to be anything more than an awkward evening, a box to check before retreating back into her solitude. Yet here she was, sitting in the glow of respect she hadn't felt in years. And it hadn't come from her title, her power, or the empire she had built. It came from the raw, unpolished words of a man who saw her not as a fallen CEO, not as a woman in a wheelchair, but as a person worth defending. The applause died down, replaced with the hum of conversation, but the warmth lingered. Claire turned to Daniel, her throat tight, her eyes burning. She didn't know what to say, but maybe she didn't need to. He just smiled, a quiet reassurance that said more than words ever could. That night marked a shift. For Claire, it was the first time in months that she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by loss, but by possibility. A life where she wasn't pitied or dismissed, but valued for her resilience, her mind, and her spirit. For Daniel, it was a reminder that kindness, simple, steady kindness, had the power to dismantle cruelty in ways wealth or status never could. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He'd only spoken the truth. But sometimes the truth is exactly what the world needs to hear. Weeks later, when Claire returned to the boardroom, the sting of her rival's cruelty no longer lingered. What stayed with her instead was the memory of one night, one mechanic, one moment that restored her faith in herself and maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of something deeper than either of them had expected. Because in the end, the story wasn't about a CEO in a wheelchair or a mechanic who surprised a room full of strangers. It was about the way compassion can silence cruelty, the way courage can spark hope, and the way love, unexpected, unpolished, imperfect, can restore a heart that had forgotten how to beat freely. So the next time you see someone dismissed, mocked, or written off because of how they look, remember this: beneath the surface, there's always more to the story.